What is going on YouTube, and welcome to another DIY video. And as the title suggests, we are going to be taking the transmission out of my 370Z. I'm going to walk you guys through all the steps in case you need to do this on your 370. The same tutorial should also be applicable for G37s as well as 350s and G35s. They'll have a similar layout as well. For those of you who've been following my channel, you know that I'm getting ready to do a clutch install on the car. So I'm going to be doing that in 3 different videos. I'm going to show you guys how to take the transmission out in this one. In the next video, I'll be showing you guys how to install a clutch and flywheel, as well as replace the slave cylinder in the transmission for the 6-speed manual. And then I'll be showing you guys how to put the transmission back in, of course. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Now, I have already jacked the car up. It is important that you get the car as high as possible. We're going to try and get it to clear the bell housing when we drop it out on the transmission. That way it's a little bit easier to work. If not, we can do all the work with the transmission still underneath the car, but it would be more convenient if we can take it out. So yeah, you want to get it up as high as possible. I ended up using some wood to try and push my jack up a little bit higher to get as much clearance as possible, and I'm using a bunch of 6-ton truck jacks to try and get the clearance. I've got the car a little over 2 feet in the air now. So with that finished, we're going to go ahead and start off by going inside the car, and we're going to have to remove the shift knob. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get the shift knob and the shift boot and everything out. That way when we begin to drop the transmission, the shifting lever won't get in the way of anything. For the 370Zs, the shift knob is notoriously difficult for getting off. It's really on there tight, so it can be difficult to remove. What I recommend you do is use a couple of microfiber towels. And then you can either use like a set of vice grips, or in my case, I just have a really large set of pliers. And you can use that to get a better grip on the shift knob to try and get the amount of torque that you need to be able to twist it off. So the pliers weren't really cutting it all that well, and you can see even with the towel, it's still already started to kind of damage the shift knob a little bit, so I've kind of lost all hope for saving this and getting it off unscathed. We're going to try a set of vice grips instead. I'm going to go ahead and try and wrap the towel back around it and get it really tight, and then hopefully with the vice grips we can get this thing off a little bit easier. So yeah, getting this shift knob off can be really tricky, and a lot of people do end up kind of breaking the shift knob like this as they're trying to take it off, just because Nissan does put it on there so tightly and the vice grips can end up really eating into the leather. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to save it, as you can see, so I'll probably end up just getting an aftermarket shift knob like a lot of people, and then I'll just put it on there when I'm done installing the new clutch. So the next step is we need to go ahead and pop up this panel right here. It's fairly straightforward. You can actually just kind of dig your fingers in underneath the panel and then just kind of pop it up and slide it away. And then there's going to be a couple of plugs that you're going to want to undo down here. Before you undo any of them though, it's important to go and disconnect your battery. That way you don't end up causing any electrical damage or anything. So disconnect the battery first, and then you can take off all these plugs. So with that battery unplugged now, we can go ahead and remove the connectors that sits on the back of here. If you have the Sport model, you will have an additional connector that sits here for your synchro rev match. Because I have the base model, I just have the one connector here for the caution light. So you just need to undo that one connector by pushing down on the tab. And then this entire piece can be set aside. Once you have that piece of trim removed, the last thing you need to do is undo 4 10mm bolts so that we can remove this boot. There's one that sits there, one in that corner right over here, and then there are 2 that sit on the back side there and there. They're all 10mm, so you'll undo all 4 of those, and then you should be able to slide this boot off of the shifter. So getting this covering plate off can be pretty tricky. As I mentioned, you do have 4 bolts here and up here that you need to remove. There are also 2 areas where wiring harness clips will go into. For those clips, if you just kind of pinch the sides of them, you'll be able to push them back out of the mounting locations here. And if you haven't removed this cover before, if you haven't done any transmission work, it might be stuck on there pretty tight like it was for me. I ended up using a set of pliers to kind of pinch these and pull it up and break that suction to kind of get this off. So now with that cover removed, we've pretty much exposed all of the shifting linkage down there. If you look down, you can actually see the floor now. We've gotten everything out of the way that we need to up here. So next we're going to go to the bottom of the car and we're going to begin taking stuff off. So the first thing we need to do down here is we need to remove this piece of support framing here. This prevents you from being able to remove the exhaust, which we're going to need to do to take the drive shaft off. So there's a bunch of 12mm bolts that just kind of line the outside of them. I believe there's a total of 10. So we need to take all of those off, and then we're going to drop this piece of frame. Alright, so the next order of business is going to be removing this section of the exhaust here. You only need to remove it from the catalytic converters or your test pipes all the way down to the muffler section. You don't need to remove the entire exhaust, it's not necessary. We just need to get this midsection off, that way we can actually get to the drive shaft up here. I have an aftermarket exhaust, so mine's going to be a little bit different than if you have, for instance, the stock exhaust. I'm just going to undo the 4 bolts that sit on this side, as well as the 6 down here, and I'm going to drop this entire section as one piece, and then we should expose the drive shaft up here. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the shield, and that'll be the last thing that gets in the way of the drive shaft. A lot of people will just bend this piece of metal out of the way to pull the shaft out, but you really only need to undo another 2 bolts to be able to get to it, so there's no real sense in bending it. Now at this point you should have full access to the drive shaft, and you'll have a couple of options here. You can either go ahead and pull the drive shaft out by undoing the 4 bolts up at this end, and then you can put some sort of stopper on the output side of the transmission to keep most of your fluid leaking out. Or what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just drain the transmission fluid now. That way I don't have to worry about leaks or anything. And then I'm going to go and actually just do a full transmission fluid change as part of the clutch install. So I'm going to go ahead and drain my fluid now, and then I'll take off the drive shaft. So at this point, we're going to start taking off the wiring harnesses and things that are on the transmission. We're going to start with the O2 sensor connectors. If you have your stock catalytic converters, or you haven't really done any exhaust work, you're most likely also going to have a bar that sits across here which connects to your cats. You'll want to remove that first. I have test pipes though, so that bar is not present, but there will just be 4 bolts that you need to undo to remove it. And then we're going to go ahead and remove these connectors. There's a little tab that sits on top of these, so if you press it down you can slide it off. So we'll just go ahead and do that to both sides to remove these connectors. And then I set those wires off to the side, that way when we begin to drop the transmission it won't nick these lines, and I'll probably go ahead and zip tie them as well. That way they're just out of the way when we begin to drop the transmission. So at this point we need to begin removing the wiring harness from the transmission. This kind of splits into 2 different directions. If you follow the wiring harness down this way, it connects to those O2 sensors which we've already removed. And then it continues back over here to what I believe is the crankshaft position sensor. We need to undo this connection and pull the wiring harness off of the bottom here. And then likewise, if we follow it this way, we end up getting to 2 connectors. So way up here, there's one for the, I believe it's the park or neutral position sensor. And continuing to follow the harness back to the back of the transmission up here, I believe this is the reverse light switch. We need to undo both of those connectors, and then we need to pull the harness back as well from this side. With all of these connection points for the harness here, it's connected by a clip to some bracket, and each of those brackets have a little bolt that you can undo to pull the bracket off. That way you don't end up needing to break the clips or anything to remove this harness. Here's one example. If you just undo this bolt, you don't have to bother trying to pull these connectors off. Just take the bolt off and you can take the entire bracket off the transmission. So we're going to do that with each of these connection points here. We're just going to undo those bolts to be able to pull these brackets off and take off the entire harness. We're going to follow it back all the way here. Remove the bracket that's up here as well. And then the harness should be free of the transmission. We can just tie it off to the side so that it's out of the way. So getting to the backup light switch that sits up here has been kind of difficult because this bracket's in the way, so I've been undoing the bolts on here. It's been fairly straightforward except for one bolt that sits above this horizontal plate right here. It was really difficult to get to it, but I managed to find a socket that was just deep enough so I could fit my socket wrench up into this pretty tight space and loosen it up. But I've got almost all those bolts off. I think there's one more sitting right up in there. And then I should be able to take this bracket off. I also disconnected the wiring harness from it. And then I should be able to just take this entire bracket out, and then that'll give me easier access to that switch. Here's that bracket that was getting in the way. This top bolt right here is really difficult to get to simply because of this bottom plate right here. Kind of gets in the way. Fortunately, my quarter inch drive socket was just deep enough to be able to get to it while still having room inside the transmission tunnel here. I have managed to get this socket undone. This is pretty tricky to get to as well if you have really fat fingers like me, but I did end up using like a thin screwdriver to try and get to the bottom tab right here to be able to push this down and release it. So now we just need to keep moving backwards from that connection, just kind of undoing each of these brackets so that we can pull this harness off. So as you can see, we now have most of that wiring harness removed. There's just a couple more bolts there up at the top that I need to take off to remove this bracket. And then the wiring harness will pretty much be disconnected from the transmission. One other thing to mention as we move forward, I'm gonna go ahead and also disconnect the breather tube. It's probably gonna be really difficult to see, but there's a breather tube that sits way up here. If you kind of reach up on top of the transmission, you should feel like a rubber hose. That hose should be able to slide off of the transmission pretty easy. So I'll go ahead and just take that off now as well. That way you don't forget about it later. So I've got this wiring harness kind of tied out of the way a little bit, so it's kind of out of the way of the transmission. The next thing we're going to do is take off the clutch line. For that, there's a 10mm bolt right here that I'm going to undo to try and give this as much wiggle room as possible. We're also going to remove this plate right here using a set of pliers. And then we'll just go ahead and unthread the clutch line. To do that, I'm using a 10mm crescent wrench, which has that extra lip on the end there to try and help prevent us from damaging the head of the bolt here. Once we've got this out, I'm hoping that we can try and stopper this using a special bolt. I think it's an M10 by 1.0. I'll leave the number here in the corner. But basically I'm going to try and stopper this to prevent us from losing as much clutch fluid as possible. I also have the clutch pedal depressed by about 1 inch using a really long extension up top. I did this when I was doing the brake fluid change, or rather when I was changing up my calipers to try and limit the amount of fluid loss. I don't know if clutch master cylinders are going to work the same way as brake cylinders do, but I figured it was worth a shot. Anyways, we'll go ahead and undo this, and then we'll see if we can stopper it up. That way we don't lose all of our clutch fluid. So at this point we should have all of the sensors removed from the transmission. Now if you read the factory service manual, one thing it tells you to do is to remove the crankshaft position sensor, which sits way up in there near the top of the bell housing. I'll circle it on the screen for you now. That sensor is extremely difficult to get to, but I've also heard that it's not completely necessary to remove it. So I'm going to see if I can take the transmission out without having to do that, because I've heard it is just a real pain in the ass to get to. So at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the two 14mm bolts that sit on the back of the transmission here that hold on the starter motor. So there's going to be two, one here and then one up there. We're going to remove both of those, and then we should be able to push the starter motor back towards the engine to get it separated from the transmission, from the flywheel and everything. Alright, so you can see there I've pushed the starter motor back a little bit just to kind of separate it from the transmission, give it a bit of space. One thing you may want to do at this point is organize your bolts for the bell housing in some way. For me, I'm just using this paper plate here, and then just putting the bolts in approximately where they go in relation to this kind of template that I've mocked up. I've just kind of listed which side is the transmission and the engine, so that way I know how to put the bolts in whenever I have to remount the transmission later. This will just make things easier for you so you don't confuse where all the bolts go. Okay, so now at this point, we need to remove this bottom plate right here. This plate holds, or rather it covers the bolts that sit on the bottom of the transmission. So we want to go ahead and remove this. I think there's a total of 8. There's 4 here on the front, and then there's another 4 here on the back side. So we're just going to remove all those bolts and then drop this plate down. So now we're going to start undoing bolts that hold the transmission onto the engine. There's a total of, I think, 12 or 14 of these, including the 2 that we already removed from the starter. I'm going to start by doing the ones on the top first, and then I'm going to do the ones on the bottom here facing the engine, and I'm going to leave the ones in the side for last. I'm going to do those once I have my jack positioned underneath the transmission here. I've already started working on trying to get a set of socket extensions and things up to those 2 top bolts. The 2 bolts that sit on the very top of the transmission are going to be by far the most difficult just because of how inaccessible they are. But I'm using a series of socket extensions and universal joints to be able to get up there. I'm going to attach another extension to the end here, and then I'm going to use a brake bar to start breaking them loose. Anyways, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started on removing those bolts. As I said, I'm going to do all of them except for the 2 pairs that are on the side here, these 2 bolts and then the other 2 on that side. I'm going to leave those in until I get my jack positioned in place. So I've got these 6 bolts removed so far, the 4 from up top as well as the 2 that we're holding on the starter. I was taking a look at this transmission, and I've heard that you can remove it with the shift linkage still on there, but I think it's going to be a lot easier to drop this transmission if I go ahead and take the shift linkage off. So there's a single bolt right here that I'm going to take out. That will remove the actual lever here from the shifter up top, and then I believe there's 3 bolts on the top side that you need to take out to be able to remove the entire shifter off. This will make dropping the transmission a lot easier because it means I can pull the transmission straight back at least a few inches to kind of get it clear of the frame here before I drop it. I have seen people do this without removing the shift linkage, but it does take a little more skill and maneuvering and a couple of people to be able to do it. So to make my life easier, I'm going to go ahead and remove it. As I said, there's just the 1 bolt that'll undo here, and then there's 3 up top that we'll remove as well. So inside the car now, I've lifted this rubber boot up, and then that reveals 3 bolts under here that you need to undo. I think they're all 10 millimeters. So we just need to unscrew all of these, and then we can take off this top plate here. Now with that shift linkage removed, this should give me a little bit more room to work with here as I begin to drop it. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the 3 bolts that face towards the front of the car. There's one way up here, here, and here. That makes 3. You need to get to them from this side, which is why we removed that plate. So I'm going to go ahead and undo those 3. Notice that I still have 4 bolts, and I've got 2 in on this side, and then 2 in over here as well. That way the transmission doesn't fall yet. I'm going to put the jack underneath the transmission before I undo those 4. I'm just going to get the rest of them out now. That way when I put the jack under here, it's easy to get to everything else. Oh, and I said there was 3 bolts. There's actually a 4th one right here, it looks like, that's not visible from the front, so you need to undo that one as well. Also, there's a small bolt, like a 10 or a 12 millimeter right here that holds this black plate on. I don't know if that bolt goes all the way through to the transmission, but I'm going to go ahead and undo this bolt as well and take this black plate off. Alright, now at this point the front of the transmission is only held on by those 2 bolts on either side, 4 total, as well as this back support here. Before I undo anything else, we need to go ahead and get the jacks supporting the weight of the transmission. For this, you have a couple of options. I'm using a transmission floor jack, which has a pretty large faceplate here that helps kind of hold the entire, I guess, area of the transmission. And I'm going to be using some ratcheting straps to try and secure it properly to the transmission, that way it doesn't fall off. Keep in mind that this thing does weigh about 150 pounds or so, which may not seem like a lot, but it's really difficult to kind of handle the size of it and try and bring it down so precisely without damaging anything. The other option that you do have is you could try and use like a couple of floor jacks. If you are going to do that, I would highly recommend getting a second set of hands to help kind of guide everything down. But since I have this floor jack here as well as those straps, I should be able to secure it fairly tight to the jack so that way it doesn't fall off. So I'm going to go ahead and jack this thing up to mate with the transmission properly and try and help starting to support the weight. Get those straps on, and then we'll go ahead and undo the 2 remaining bolts on either side of the transmission, and then we're also going to begin taking off this back plate here. So you should have a total of 14 bolts now removed from the bell housing, which means that the engine side of the transmission is pretty much just being held up by the jack as well as the input shaft on the transmission itself. At this point, we need to remove the 4 bolts that are holding on this back plate here, and then at that point it'll pretty much just be resting on the jack. Again, make sure that you guys have a really good floor jack or something in place here. You got to make sure it's really secure. If you undo these, it could just fall on top of you. So you want to be really careful. You want to make sure it's pretty well supported. I've got my transmission jack in place. I've got it all strapped down, so it shouldn't come falling on top of me. So I'm going to undo these 4, and then once that's done, we're going to just try and back the transmission out towards the rear of the car by a few inches. I might drop this end a little bit just to kind of clear the shift linkage up here. But it should be able to just kind of slide back, and then we should be able to bring it down. So that's the transmission pulled out now. Fairly straightforward. If you guys are able to pick up a transmission jack like this, I highly recommend it. This thing made wiggling the transmission out a breeze. It's especially helpful because if you can see here, it does have all of these like adjusting knobs and things on it, which allow you to kind of tilt the transmission around to be able to angle it out a bit easier. Here, give you a quick look what the bolt pattern looks like on this. So there's a total of 14 bolts, as I said. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 for the starter, 12, 13, and 14. So these are where all of those bolts are going to sit. You will have also seen that diagram in the previous shot, just kind of showing where everything's at. These 2 top bolts right here are going to be the most tricky to get to, but once you have those off, the others are pretty easy to access. With the transmission out, here's where that breather hose is. You should have already taken this off by now, but in case you're just kind of watching this through, that's where that hose is going to be located. You will need to make sure you take that off. And then there's going to be a bracket right here that holds the rest of that hose. So whenever you take this bolt out, that bracket's going to be attached to it. You'll just want to remove that entire thing and set it aside. Here is where I took that black plate off earlier. This is the plate itself. So when this thing is sitting on here, It's going to be positioned like that. And you can see that there's this one bolt right here that's really difficult to get to. That's where you need to find the right size socket if you want to take this off. And it makes access to this plug a whole lot easier if you can do that. A couple of other things. So in the next video, I will be doing the slave cylinder swap out. I'll be putting in the replacement part there because the OEM ones are known to go bad. So I've got the replacement from Z1 Motorsports. So we'll be putting that in. When you're strapping this transmission down, you may want to watch out for where the plate is that connects to your clutch line. You just want to make sure you don't crush anything that could be damaged. But yeah, that's how to get the transmission removed. Fairly straightforward. As I said, if all you have is a couple of floor jacks, that'll work, but a transmission jack, I bought this for a couple $100. Really made easy work of getting this transmission out. Allowed me to tilt it back and forth a little bit to be able to pull it out properly. So here we are inside the transmission tunnel now, and just kind of want to show you guys a couple of other things. First off, that right there, that is your starter motor. This thing will pretty much just be loose, so whenever you undo those bolts, you'll be able to kind of slide it out of the way. That's kind of important because you want to make sure that it doesn't interfere with the transmission bell housing whenever you begin to remove it. That right there is going to be your crankshaft position sensor. You don't have to take that out, and it is really difficult to do so with the transmission in. You just need to make sure that whenever you're reinstalling the transmission, you get it aligned properly before you start mating it back up against the engine. That way you don't damage the sensor or anything. But I was able to leave that in, no problem. You will have a couple of guide pins as well that'll kind of allow you to align the transmission up properly whenever you're sticking it back in. That'll prevent you from getting any sort of misalignment. But yeah, so now you can of course see that is our pressure plate there that sits on the outside of the clutch. Your clutch is actually going to be inside of this, and then the thing with the gears in the back of here, that's your flywheel. I'm going to be showing you guys how to replace the clutch and the flywheel and everything in the next video, so y'all can look forward to that. Again, just another look at everything here, just kind of showing you where all the bolts are. There's the top two, and then you have the 3 on the side there, 2 at the starter, 4 on the bottom, another 2 on the side, and then the other 2 up top. So just to kind of give you guys again another look at where all this stuff is situated. Alright guys, and I'm going to go ahead and end it there. I've had to move inside now because the winds are getting pretty bad outside. We're under tornado watch with it being Texas and all. Pulling this transmission wasn't as difficult as I thought. With the right tools and things, it actually won't be that difficult. Again, I highly recommend investing in a proper transmission jack, but you can do it with 4 jacks as well. It'll work for you. Make sure you have a bunch of 1/2-inch drive extensions to be able to get to a couple of those top bolts. Other than that, fairly straightforward. So I hope you guys found this video helpful. Make sure you give it the thumbs up if you did. You can also subscribe to my channel for more videos. In the next one, I will be showing you guys how to actually replace the clutch and the flywheel, as well as doing the slave cylinder swap out. So you guys can stay tuned for those videos as well. I will also be doing some exhaust work. I will be installing some new mufflers on the car here in a couple of weeks. I'll also be doing long tube headers. I have both of those coming in the mail, so that should be happening towards the end of January. I've also figured out which supercharger kit I'm going to be getting. It's a relatively new kit. It was only announced back in November, and sales are planning on starting in January. So I'm going to be one of the first people to be able to get a hold of this. My plan is to probably place an order in mid-February or so. For those of you who are following the 370Z forums, you might actually know what I'm talking about. But I will be announcing which kit I plan to get in a couple of weeks or so you guys will get an idea of what I'm going to be doing. The power numbers on this new kit are really promising. 500 horsepower on pump gas is looking to be very realistic. So I'm super excited, and between now and then I'll also be installing a fuel pump just to get ready for that. So you can also subscribe to my channel if you want to follow the supercharger build. And once again, thank you guys for watching. See y'all in the next one. Later.